Hello and welcome to Mr. Quickest Teaches. Mr. Quickest Teaches is an online learning hub that provides video lessons and online tuition in English literature and other subjects of the humanities in the British curriculum that prepares you for the IGCSE, O-level and A-level. In today's lesson, I'll be providing a detailed analysis of the poem Midterm Break by Seamus HEANEY. My analysis will be presented with rolling annotations of the stanzas, lines, and important words and phrases in the poem. I'll emphasize the themes, literary devices, figurative and poetic, tone, structure, language of the poem. To purchase the course that provides stanza by stanza, line by line, and word for word written and video analysis of all the 15 poems in the IGCSE anthology for 2022, visit mrquickestteaches.com. The written course has been particularly helpful to students sitting the IGCSE because it provides clear guidance on the approved writing styles. Without further ado, let's demystify Midterm Break by Seamus HEANEY. Firstly, let's speak about the poet. Seamus HEANEY was born on the 13th of April 1939. He died on the 30th of August 2013. He was 74 years old. He was an Irish poet, playwright, and translator. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1995. So the poem is actually has 8 stanzas. So this is the first 4 stanzas of the poem. 7 of the stanzas are tacits. That means that each of them has only 3 lines in each stanza, but the last stanza is just a single line, or is described as a monostich. Let's begin by reading the poem first, and then we'll speak in detail about the poem. The poem chronicles the aftermath of when the narrative voice hears about the death of his brother, and then he moves from the house to school, and he tells us about where he sees his father, where he sees his mother, and other sympathizers in the poem. The poem uses a lot of auditory imagery, and so that's a point that as you listen to the poem, that's a point that you should use your imaginations to sort of bring out, about the crying, about the silence of his mother, and other voices that we hear, like Big Jim Evans and the elderly people that come to him and say they are sorry for his loss. And for me, I think that the tone of the poem, even though the poem deals with loss, the tone of the poem for me is a bit distant. And I say this because it's like somebody who is in denial about death. Now, I've heard other people say that the tone is sorrowful, but I beg to differ because Hine seems to have like his wits about him. You know, usually when you've suffered a loss, you don't have everything put together, but Hine seems to have everything well put together, and he tells us exactly what happens, who says what, and all of that. I mean, if you've ever experienced a loss before, and a really deep loss, more often than not, you can't even remember the events that occurred in the time. But Hine seems to be able to know everything that happened and who did what and how he reacted. And for me, I think he had to be like the big man of the house because his father was in tatters. His mother didn't know what to do, even though she appeared stoic. So he had to sort of stand up for the family. And I think because he was standing up and trying to, be the man of the house, the person who sort of holds everything together, he appears a bit listless, like a trance. I don't think he's like sorrowful and weepy and all of that, even though the mood of the poem, that is the way we, the readers, we react to the poem, eventually is going to be something of sorrow, of pity, of sympathy for the family and the loss. And especially because the loss that the family suffered was of a small child. And I think that's one of the striking things that Hine does in the poem. He uses a lot of suspense, and he takes the reader from one space into the next, and then in the final monostich, or the final one-line stanza, he finally reveals the identity of the person that died. And then, the fact that the life was so brief was really, really touching. So let me begin by reading out the poem, and then we dive into it and bring it apart. Midterm Break by Seamus HEANEY. I sat all morning in the college sick bay, counting bells, kneeling classes to a close. At 2 o'clock, our neighbors drove me home. In the porch, I met my father crying. He had always taken funerals in his stride, and Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram when I came in, and I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hand and tell me they were sorry for my trouble. Whispers informed strangers I was the eldest, away at school, as my mother held my hand in hers and coughed out angry tearless sighs. At 10 o'clock, the ambulance arrived with a corpse, stanched and bandaged by the nurses. Next morning, I went up into the room. Snowdrops and candles soothed the bedside. I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. Paler now, wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. No gaudy scars. The bumper knocked him clear. A 4-foot box, a foot for every year. So we see that the cause of death was an auto accident. So the car knocked the child. But let's go and then speak a bit about the poem. For me, the first thing that jumps at me is the title. The title is Midterm Break. And the title of Midterm Break is at variance, or it's sort of a departure from what happens in the poem, the main theme of the poem, which is death. The title suggests that the poetic voice was, going to enjoy a time away with his family at midterm. Instead, the poem deals with a very deep or heavy theme, which is death. It deals with the death of the poet's 4-year-old brother in an auto accident, and his almost zombie-like movement from school to home through the various parts of the house, his interactions with the mourners, and his sighting of his brother's corpse. That's the final thing that happens. So, for me, the title itself sort of throws the reader off, but then it has like way more deeper, heavier theme than just Midterm Break, a time of fun. So the poem is in the first person point of view, and we see that in the use of the first word I. So from the get-go, the poetic voice informs the reader that I. So he's the one, he's speaking about his own experiences. And then he reveals to us his posture. He says he sat all day in the college sick bay, all morning in the college sick bay. And then he was in the all morning, that's the duration, location, college sick bay. Now, the fact that he sat tells us that he wasn't feeling unwell. You can't be in the hospital and be unwell and be sitting. So he sat there all morning instead of lying down there. So the line reveals that the person he was pensive, and then he needed a place to be alone. And he wanted to be alone with his thoughts. And so it reveals to us that the persona went to the college sick bay, not because he was sick, but because he just needed a place to be away from. And I think it sort of reveals as well the sickness of his mind, in the sense that he had a lot of heavy things to think about. And so he had to take this time away. And then the use of the word college reveals to us that, especially because this poem has like the British-Irish ancestry to it, tells us that he was maybe preparing for his GCSEs, and then he was in school, and then he lost his brother around this period. We also see the alliteration and use of consonants in the second line of the poem. It says, counting bells, kneeling classes to a close. So consonants is seen in the repetition of the L sound, while the alliteration is seen in the repetition of the C sound in counting classes close. So that's like there's this combination of the counting of the bells and then the kneeling of the this thing that provides vivid auditory imagery of the sound of the tolling bells. Now the word tolling is very important, especially the word kneeling is very important, because in times past the kneeling of bells were used to foreshadow death. So in more primitive times, or we are not as developed or modern times as these, especially in Europe and in some of those other countries, the tolls of bells or the kneeling of bells were used to indicate or to foreshadow that a death had occurred. Now, in this instance, the reader doesn't know what's going to follow. I know we've read the entire poem, but if you're just reading the poem from the beginning, you realize you're not sure that the events that are to occur. But the use of the word bells kneeling foreshadows that this poem, there's something about death in it. So something as innocent as a class coming to a close is infused with the word kneeling to tell the reader that, see, there's something terrible that's happening here. There's something bad that's going to happen. So it foreshadows that death has occurred, and it's announcing a death. So when you read the poem and you're like, okay, it's just about classes, why is that important? It's important because as the poem begins to develop, the reader begins to realize that in fact, indeed, a death has occurred, and someone quite young has died. Now he continues and says, at 2 o'clock, our neighbors drove me home. So it was his neighbors that came for him, not his parents. So why did his neighbors come for him, not his parents? Why were his parents indisposed? So these are some of the questions that come up, and it also tells us about the importance of family and about relationship. How sometimes you may be in a bind, and then your parents may be unable to help you, or those your relative may be unable to help you. It may be friends and acquaintances that may come to a head. And in this instance, it is his neighbors that came and then took him from school back home. In the second stanza, Ine is at home, and then he's greeted by this sight. He says, in the porch. The porch is a very public place. A very public place. He says, I met my father crying. So we see here that it's a very public place, and then the very first thing that greets Ine as he gets home is his father. So you see here that there's also a lack of punctuation as well, because it's supposed to be something like, in the porch, comma, I met my father crying, because in the porch is an independent, it's a dependent clause. But Hine doesn't even use a comma because he's shocked at the sight of seeing his father cry. And the use of the word I met reveals that the sight was unexpected. It wasn't something that he expected. And his father was crying in a very public place. So this is like a very, very striking and touching image for the reader. Because usually men do not cry, especially they don't cry that publicly. But his father is crying in the porch publicly for everybody to see. And when Hine sees this, after he says, I met my father crying, he employs a dash. The dash suggests that Hine froze in shock. He was shocked, and so he froze, he paused. Dashes are usually used, especially at the end of a line, to indicate a pause. So he paused at the sight of seeing his father cry. And this is a very touching image because the father is crying publicly and everybody can see. And then look at what Hine says. He says that he had always taken funerals in his stride. And this, is very, very powerful, because here Hine exposes to the reader that, see, all along, my father usually takes funerals in his stride. And my father is very masculine. He's stoic. So always taking funerals in his stride reveals that Hine's father was stoic. When tragedy occurs, he's unaffected by the tragedy. He doesn't allow the tragedy to get to him. And his use of the word in his stride sort of creates the impression that, because that's like an idiom, it creates the impression that his father doesn't miss any step. He just continues. He doesn't miss any step. And when you look at this, for example, his father is breaking some of the law, in quotes, of masculinity, in the sense that people sometimes make say that real men do not cry. But his father is crying here. And after he exposes that he had always taken funerals in his stride, which means that there are other people who have died. Again, the use of the word funerals and the word kneeling tells us that indeed somebody is dead. So indeed somebody is dead. It reinforces the idea of a death. And then he employs a dash again a second time. And the second time, maybe he sort of paused to maybe console his father, or even to take in the sight, or sort of catch himself. And after he does this, he tells us what happened. He says, and Big Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. So Big Jim Evans presumably is his father's friend. And then the use of the word big to describe Jim Evans suggests that he's a man's man. And that means that Big Jim Evans fits society's conceptualization of who a man is, or who a man should be. So he's big. And then he's Jim Evans, and so he's not crying. And Jim Evans' attitude towards the dead talks about how sometimes society deals with death. And Heaney uses reported speech to tell us what Big Jim Evans said. So he uses reported speech to reveal that these were not Big Jim Evans's words, but he has these were like the words that, the idea of what he said. It was a hard blow, and it was a hard blow is euphemism. So it exemplifies the niceties that sympathizers usually say as they try to console those who are grieving after a loss, with the hope of tempering the pain of grief. And I think one of the most awkward things that you would ever have to deal with is a death. When somebody is dead, how to console the grieving member of the family or grieving friend is one of the things that, even though society has been in existence for thousands of years or for millennia, society has been unable to have like a proper way to deal with grief. So Big Jim Evans says, oh, sorry, it's a hard blow. So it's a hard blow just creates the effect that yes, it's painful, but then it's going to subside over time. But that's not what happens after. Death is final. Whoever is dead forever, and there's nothing that you can do to temper that loss. But that's how Big Jim Evans deals with the poem, the death of the loss of that the family is experiencing. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that we are going to see a lot of auditory imagery, and we see that as well. In the first stanza, it was the bells kneeling classes to a close. In this second stanza, it is his father crying, and then the words of Big Jim Evans. So we see here that the auditory imagery continues to roll into the poem, and the idea of crying and speaking. And so when you go to any place where there's been a loss, for example, there's a lot of talking and people speak about the death and all of that. In the third stanza, Heaney continues to move, because it's almost as if Heaney is carrying the reader with him as he goes. Wherever he is, that's where becomes the focus of the poem. He says that the baby cooed and laughed and rocked the pram. The baby represents the innocence and a sense of lostness. So the baby is like a physical manifestation of innocence. The baby doesn't know what's happening, so it's cooing, it's laughing, it's happy. There's this joy that the baby expresses. And again, we see this auditory imagery as well. So the baby's coo and laugh reduces the sense of grief in the setting. Whenever there has been a loss, for example, and you see children come to the funeral, for example, they run around and then they play. It shows that people do whatever they can to lighten the sense of grief, because grief is very heavy. So exemplifies what people do to lighten. So people share jokes, they say things about the dead person, on and on and on. And he continues that, and rock the pram. So rock the pram provides visual imagery of the child's excitement as seen in it. So he's happy, he's about to leap out of his pram to say hello to Heaney. And we also see the repetition of and in the first line of the third stanza as well. This emphasizes the sound and action and how it broke the funereal setting. The setting is very heavy and very sorrowful, but the child's actions momentarily freezes all of these. When I came in, so when he came in, the second thing that he sees is that he comes into the epicenter of this morning, and then this is what he sees, that the baby cooing and laughing. Now, he then continues that, and I was embarrassed by old men standing up to shake my hands. So for me, this line is one of the reasons why I'm saying that Heaney wasn't sorrowful, but instead I think he was a bit detached from reality. He was in denial. Usually when death occurs, people are usually in denial. I think he was, because he had the presence of mind to realize that there were old men standing up to shake his hands. And this is really important, because usually it's the younger person that has to stand up to greet or to shake the hands of older people, but they are the ones standing up to greet his hand, because when it comes to grief changes the position, and then it is during grief that sometimes the law, even the conventions that human beings have set, are put on hold. So a convention like a younger person always standing up to shake an older person's hand is suspending during a grief or during the period of grief. And it also reveals that Heaney was still clear-headed and distant. So he still knew what was happening. He understood that the action of them standing up to shake his hand was an anomaly. he continues that, we also see the use of enjambment as well in this stanza. And we see that in the flow of words from one stanza into the next. And we are going to see that because the third stanza is going to flow into the fourth. So Heaney's use of enjambment presents the poem as an act of continuous movement through different settings and from room to room. He also tells us about the fluid nature of grief. Grief is something that is continuous. It doesn't just stop immediately. It continues over time. So, like I mentioned, the enjambment is continues and ties into the from the third stanza into the fourth and the 10th line of the poem, and says, "And tell me they were sorry for my trouble." So here we see a second use of euphemism as well. So when you are speaking about this poem or writing about this poem, it was a hard blow is euphemism. Sorry for your trouble is another euphemism, again to downplay the heaviness of death. So sorry for my trouble highlights the niceties at funerals and the patronizing manner with which mourners speak of death. So here people say something like, "Oh, he's in a better place now, he's no longer in pain, and he's gone to heaven," and all of that. But then the death is still painful, no matter who it is or how old it is that the person has lived, especially if the person is like a friend or a family member. And then the quote also reveals that the persona remembers, in the Jim Evans example, I spoke about how that was like an indirect speech, but here, remembers the exact words that the people used, the old men used. So he says here that the quote also reveals that the persona remembers the old man's exact words. Even old people deal awkwardly with death. So it's not only young people that deal awkwardly with death, but then even the aged and those who should sort of know how better, with experience. But we see here that experience doesn't help anybody when it comes to death. And he continues and says, "Whispers inform strangers I was the eldest away at school." Whispers inform strangers is personification. So here Heaney personifies the whispers, the word whispers. So he personifies it and creates the impression that the whispers are like human beings. And then they are going from ear to ear, and they are exposing the identity of Heaney as the eldest child, and that he had been away from school. It's almost as if the whispers were making excuses for why maybe Heaney is only just coming to the funeral. So we see here that when it comes to death, kneeling is used, provides auditory imagery. The crying also provides auditory imagery. Jim Evans saying it was a hard blow. The old man also saying sorry for your trouble. Also, it's like auditory imagery. And another form of auditory imagery again that Heaney uses here is the use of the word whispers. And usually during funerals, we get this sense of a lot of auditory imagery, because crying and speaking and sometimes shouting and wailing are the ways that the attitude that people present after a death. So as auditory imagery, it also creates a striking sense of place. So when it comes to some of these questions, you could be asked, how does Seamus HEANEY present a very striking sense of place in the poem Meet and Break? And one of the key things that he uses is auditory imagery. So it also creates a striking sense of place as the mourns blends with the particularly mournful sound. So the mourns of the crying and all of that blends with the mournful sounds together, and then it creates a very, very striking sense of place. As my mother held my hand. So here we see the introduction of the second parent, his mother. So we see here that as this fusion between his mother and him, like I see it as a umbilical union. When children are in the womb, there's this link between a mother and a child. So when the child is, because of the umbilical cord, the child is also able to receive sustenance from his mother. I think here there's this link between them. She held his hand, presumably I think to also protect him from death that she thinks is in the air. We also see the continued use of enjambment because it flows into the fifth stanza. So Heaney fuses stanzas 4 and 5 together. This produces a visual representation of the link between the mother and the child, because he says, as my mother held my hand. So there's this fusion. So he uses enjambment as well to tie that idea and present visual imagery between the mother and his mother and him, the link in their hands, into the fifth line. And this is particularly striking, and for me I think it's Ine does a fantastic job here, presenting not only with auditory imagery, but with visual and other forms of imagery, the events that occurred in the aftermath of a death. He continues that in hers, completely, the idea is that his mother wanted to shield him. She wanted to shield him from death. And mothers are usually very protective. We see that, for example, with chickens. They try and then they open their wings and then they are all the children running to it for protection when there's a hawk circling. I think that's the kind of idea that is presented here. And he continues that, coughed out. Coughed out suggests that Ine's mother's deep sense of grief and an inability to properly articulate her sorrow. She couldn't speak out. And one of the things I've found, for example, is that society, when it comes to sorrow, we want everybody to behave in the same way. Oh, what did he cry? Was he falling on the ground? We want everybody to behave in a certain kind of way to sorrow. So, for example, someone will say, "Oh, Ine's father's attitude towards the death was, more sorrowful than the mother." But the mother was dying inwardly. She couldn't articulate a sorrow. So she coughed out angry tears. So she was very heavy inside. There's this anger talks about her fierceness. She's fierce. She's angered like a lioness. But with whom? Is she angry at death? So there's this heaviness that the woman sort of presents. Tearless sighs suggests that the matron of the house, that is Ine's mother, did not expel tears as a sign of her grief, but sighs. No, sighs talk about frustration. As sounds of frustration, sighs reveal that she expelled deep groans, like very heavy groan. Her behavior suggests that she was in deep shock. So she was shocked by this death. So even though we know that eventually we are going to realize that it was Ine's younger brother that died, at this point, the reader is going to get the impression, if you've not read today, if it's your first time of reading the poem, you're going to know that it's indeed somebody from Ine's family that died. Coughed out angry tearless sighs provides vivid auditory imagery of Ine's mother's intense grief. She was really grieving, but then it wasn't noisy. And I think, in a way, presents her as someone that is stoic. Now, when you hear the word stoic or stoicism, for example, it's not about somebody who doesn't feel emotions. No. Stoicism speaks about a person who feels emotions, but then the person is able to control their emotion. So they have the ability to control the way they present their emotions. So they are not all over the place and running all over. But then she started, but then at the same time she has this ability to control her emotion. And another important point I think that sort of comes up is the idea that Ine's mother and father sort of switch roles. Switch roles after in this enterprise. There's this switching roles. So his mother, who is supposed to be the one crying, maybe in the porch, for example, she's the one that is, expelling angry tearless sighs. But his father, who society would think should be, have its wit about him, maybe not cry as much, be strong for his family, is the one that is crying. And this is a very important point when you're asked about how Ine powerfully presents the theme of death. Because one of the superimposing themes of this poem is death. That's one of the things that he does. He presents to us the switching roles between his parents. So his father sort of shelves the idea that a man is supposed to be strong and cries. But then his mother is the one that remains stuck in the process. Now he says at 10 o'clock the ambulance arrived with the corpse. 8 hours after Ine got home, because remember he got home at 2 o'clock. 8 hours after, the corpse was delivered. So the ambulance is presented as the purveyor of death, like a tradesman of death. And corpse is another word, apart from the word kneeling, apart from the word funeral and crying and all of that. Corpse is another word that strengthens the idea that indeed there has been a death. So the mention of the word ambulance also provides additional auditory imagery of the blast of sirens. So the ambulance brought brought the corpse home, stanched and bandaged. Stanched and bandaged talks about beautification of the corpse. So they stanched it. They covered all the portions of the body that may expel blood. And then bandage tells us that it was further wrapped so that the blood, so the body was being presented as nice as possible. And this is really important because people want to find out if their relatives suffered. And when the body is battered, the grief is even more. Yes, death is something that we cannot sort of run away from, but when someone experiences a very painful death, it also multiplies the sense of sorrow that the family feels. Stanch and Bande suggest that the nurses did their best to reduce the brutal nature of the circumstance of the death, presumably to make the loss more bearable on the mourners. So that's what like the nurses did. So from the fifth stanza, like I said, roles switch between Heaney's parents. In stanza 2 of the poem, Heaney's father cries loudly and publicly in the porch. In the fifth stanza, his mother, however, is mostly quiet, coughed out angry, tearless sighs. There appears to be a switch in roles between his parents. People tend to think that the more someone cries during the morning, the more affected they are. But is it true? Is it really the case that the more somebody cries, the more affected they are? I don't think so. But people want to see the external expression of grief. The next morning, I went up into the room. So the next morning, Heaney reveals that he's gone up, possibly because he didn't see the body immediately. I think maybe because he was confused and listless. He went up into the room. So at least their house must have been like a one-story house. Snowdrops and candles soothe the bedside. Snowdrop symbolizes innocence and purity. So the flower snowdrop symbolizes innocence and purity. And he also foreshadows that it was a child that died. It was a child. It was somebody who was really young that died because innocence and purity. And a candle, and then while candles is a symbol for the fleeting nature of life and a reminder to all of us, even us the readers as well, that we are all going to die. We are all going to die. It's a reminder that we're all going to die. Like a candle, we're all going to go off, as it were. And this is a life that has been, a candle sort of, and it's gone off. And it soothed the bedside. Soothed suggests that together both objects brought a sense of comfort to the setting. So we need to comfort people. When somebody loses a family member or a friend or somebody, we have to be there and soothe the person. We have to provide comfort, and here we see that the innocence of the child and even like the brevity of the life in a way sort of provides comfort. When it comes to death is a very confusing experience. And then Heaney reveals to us that I saw him for the first time in 6 weeks. So the last time that Heaney had seen his brother was 6 weeks ago. So this reveals the tragic confession that the deceased had been alive when he last saw him. So the last time he saw his brother, maybe presumably when he was off to school, when Heaney was off to school, he had seen his brother and his brother was fine. But now he is dead. It also reveals the suddenness with which death occurs. So death appears without warning. Paler now. Paler now renews the loss of color at death. So the boy had lost his, when people die, they lose their color. It's the flow of blood in the body that gives us our color. Here the boy had become pale. We also see enjambment as well. So enjambment into the next line allows Heaney to retain his use of the tacet stanzas. So the tacet stanzas is retained, and we see that he says, and he continues and tells us that wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. For me, this poem is very emotional. Wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple suggests that it's almost as if the deceased, that has a dead body, deliberately wore it. He was wearing a poppy bruise on his left temple. He was wearing it. It's not, the bruise was not there as spite, but it was there because the dead one wanted it on. It also provides visual imagery of the location and color of the deceased fatal injury on his left temple. He continues that he lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. So that's simile there. So he lay in the 4-foot box as in his cot. And the use of the word he lay creates the impression that the dead body was there purposely. And he also provides, so it's almost as if the dead one walked into the thing by himself. It also provides visual imagery of the deceased relaxed in a coffin as in a cot, such that the deceased lay inside it by himself because he was still alive. As in, Scott also strengthens the idea that this deceased was in fact a child, and it was like a little boy that had died. And no gaudy scars. The bumper knocked him clear. So no gaudy scars tries to impress on the reader that there was no physical signs of blunt trauma on the child. So he had no scars on him. There was no deep cuts. Then the bumper knocked him clear reveals that the deceased was killed in an auto accident. So it was a car that killed him, but then knocked him clear creates the impression that the death was painless. Heaney concludes the poem with a single line, a monostitch. And because he uses a monostitch, it stands out and shows the deviation from the rest of the Tacet stanzas. He says, a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. Heaney ends the poem with a riddle. It's like a riddle. I think he uses a riddle because, life and death and the circumstance under which some people die, life itself is a riddle. And he wants the reader to know that death is also a riddle. So death is a riddle that it takes people from every age. From children to elderly people it takes. And Heaney's dead brother was only 4 years old. Like if you unravel the riddle, it says a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. So his brother was only 4 years old, and now he's dead. And he also highlights the brevity of life. That life is very brief, and we can all, die at any time. Some of the themes of the poem for me, the main theme is death, and there's also death of a younger sibling, a family's loss or grief, innocence, the brevity of life. And usually it's the themes that the IGCSE questions are usually built around. So you can be asked, how does Seamus HEANEY powerfully present the theme of death in Meet and Break? Now let's speak about the structure. For an IGCSE question, trying to answer the question in the IGCSE, it's important that you speak about the structure of the poem. So the poem is 8 stanzas. So the first 7 stanzas are tacet, 3-line stanzas, while the 8th is a single line. So the poet's use of tacets helps him retain an almost uniform number of lines in the poem. And I think his use of tacet as well also makes him sort of keep his thoughts in check. It's, sometimes when you're trying to, you don't want to lose concentration, you get like maybe something like a fidget spinner. And I think the use of the tacet stanza was in his way of keeping himself in check, so he doesn't lose his train of thought. And we also see the use of enjambment as well. So stanzas 3 to 6 is fused using enjambment to highlight the fluidity of the persona's movement from room to room and his interaction with multiple other mourners in their house after the death of his brother. The final stanza is a single line stanza or monostitch. The use of the single line makes the stanza stand out, and it reveals the age of the deceased, that is the child was 4 years old. And for me, I think that was like the end of it. The end of it, the resolution of the poem was particularly mournful, and it's very, very sorrowful, and it must have been really heavy for Heaney and his family. If you enjoyed this lesson, please visit mrquickesteaches.com and you can purchase courses that allow you to customize how you learn, and you also provide stanza by stanza, line by line, and word for word written analysis of all the 15 poems in the IGCSE anthology, analysis of the prose as well. For 2022, some of the schools are dealing with Purple Hibiscus, and the poetry that they are dealing with is also the Crucible, and we also find like details of those, the prose and the drama there, and also information on the unseen poem if your school writes the unseen paper. You can also visit Mr. Quickest Teaches and book private tuition for the IGCSE for English language, geography, history. If you need help in any of those subjects, please reach out, and then you can sign up and you study together. You can also join our IGCSE tribe on Telegram. Just search for Mr. Quickest Teaches IGCSE Literature at and you find that there as well. So thank you for joining the class, and here you have it. Midterm Break by Seamus HEANEY has been demystified. Until next time, bye bye.